Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I'm going to talk through all of my books in Spanish, o todos mis libros en castellano. So for those of you who haven't heard by now, I am a middle school Spanish teacher. I double majored in both English literature and Spanish language in university. And I lived in Sevilla in Spain for several months during my university program. So I had covered some of my unread books in Spanish in the back to school teacher tag, but I thought, you know what, I really should do a separate video about all of my Spanish language books. There's a big push now to read more translated fiction, which I wholeheartedly applaud, but I don't always read translated fiction because sometimes I do read things in their original language. Well, just Spanish. I can't read anything in its original language outside of Spanish. I'm not that fluent. So today I thought I'd talk you through some of the books that I bought in Spain, that I read in Spain, and some of the books that I have yet to read in Spanish to keep up my fluency. So the first thing that I read in Spanish all the way through was the play Bodas de Sangre, or Blood Wedding, by Federico Garcia Lorca. And this is still one of my favorite books of all time, or at the very least a contender. It is a stunning, fabulous play. It is full of anything you could ever want. There's a love triangle, there's feuding families, there's symbolism, there's anti-violence language, death shows up as a beggar, as well as the moon being a speaking character. It is absolutely fantastic. I loved reading through this. We read it in AP Spanish, and it was my favorite part of the entire year. Then, moving into college, I took a Latin American literature course in my freshman year, where we read a ton of excerpts of early pieces, which I no longer have with me, or they're buried in my notebook somewhere. But we read pieces of Christopher Columbus's diaries and journals and those of other conquistadores. And we also read accounts of monks from the opposite perspective during that same period of time, and were able to compare the two and compare who was really telling the truth in terms of how the conquest of Latin America went. Here's a hint, the conquistadors were lying to everybody, including themselves. And then went into such works as Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who is a fantastic woman, and it is on my list of things to do to get a complete set of her poetry. She was a young woman in the 15 or 1600s in Mexico who was relatively well off, but decided to become a nun, not out of a particular religious vocation, but because she wanted to become a scholar, and that was the only way that she could do it, was to join a convent and gain access to their libraries. She also became an incredible poet and is a wonderful Mexican feminist symbol, and I really need to read more of her works, but we read some for that class. We then finished the year with two physical books that I still have, which are both plays. The first is El Eterno Femenino by Rosario Castellanos, which is a fantastically feminist Mexican play about a young woman, Lupita, and the many other women who walk in and out of a beauty salon. But in the middle of their conversations, Lupita then gets to speak with many feminist figures from hundreds of years ago in history, starting with Sor Juana de la Cruz, and even including Eve. And it is an incredible feminist manifesto, and I remember absolutely loving it. Although in flipping through it, I've proven to myself that I definitely need to reread it. We ended by reading Salón de Belleza by Mario Bellatin, who I believe is also a Mexican author. Aha! He was born in Mexico. He studied cinematography in Cuba and began writing in Peru. So he is from all over Latin America. And this again is a novel taking place in a beauty salon from the eyes of the manager or the owner, I believe. looking at all of his workers, all of the clients who come in, and just musing on modern society and life and gender politics through owning the beauty salon and watching everyone come and go. I, of course, took many other Spanish classes throughout my high school and university career, but a lot of those were either straight history courses or straight language courses, so I'm not going to include those textbooks here, even though I did really enjoy those classes. The next time that I studied literature was in Spain itself, where I took 2 literature courses. Well, technically 3, because the first was a course on translation and how to translate various types of literature, from monologues from plays to opening pages of very famous novels to user's manuals and everything in between. And I loved learning about how not just to translate word for word, but to translate for meaning and for style. The 2 straight literature courses that I took were first the equivalent of a Romanticism to Modernism course. We first began reading from this packet that was put together for us, and their version of Romanticism to Modernism means that we began in the 18th century and went all the way through to modern day. So we have excerpts in here from a variety of poems and letters and plays and short novels, and I love looking through at my notes in 2 languages. Looking through, some of my favorites were a poem called Sobre la mala educación de la nobleza, or On the Bad Education of the Nobility, by Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos. Excerpts from Las Cartas Marruecas, or The Moroccan Letters, by José de Caldaso, and La Canción del Pirata by José de Espronceda. Definitely a traditional romantic piece. I actually like romantic poetry better in Spanish than I do in English, as it turns out. I never expected that, but there we are. We also read 3 distinct books for that class as well. The first was my absolute favorite, which was El Sí de las Niñas by Leandro Fernández de Moratín. I wrote 2 papers on this play. I loved it so much. It is about a young girl who is preparing to be married to a much older man, and it was written in, and it all takes place in the 18th century. So they're all in this inn, but she is actually in love with a man much closer to her own age, and about all the machinations that they go through to try to come together, the older man trying to figure out what on earth is even going on and what he's going to do about it, and her mother trying to foil them at every turn. And it feels wonderfully like not quite an Austen play, but something that Austen would have been inspired by. And the main point of it is helping to move spectators and to move the older generation away from the idea of arranged marriages for money, but towards marriages of choice for love. We also read Don Álvaro, o La Fuerza del Sino, by El Duque de Rivas, and the title translates to Don Álvaro, or the Force of Destiny, or the Force of Fate, which is a dark and sweeping romantic and slightly gothic tale of slighted love and people wandering through storms, crying out at the gods. It feels very much like a combination of Wuthering Heights and King Lear. And funnily enough, I discovered recently that this was also turned into an opera, an Italian opera. So I'm very intrigued to reread this and then listen through to that opera. And finally, we ended with Rimas by Gustavo Adolfo Becker, who was a very famous mid-19th century poet who wrote short poems. I don't remember if they're sonnets particularly, but they're very, very short and easy and very beautiful. I mean, I'll give you an example. This one is easy to translate. It's Rima number 38, which is only 4 lines. Los suspiros son aire, y van al aire. Las lágrimas son agua, y van al mar. Dime, mujer, cuando el amor se olvida, ¿Sabes tú a dónde va? Which translates to, sighs are air, and they go to the air. Tears are water, and they go to the sea. Tell me, woman, when one forgets love, do you know where it goes? I also took a Literature of the Golden Age class, which meant we were reading a lot of Renaissance works. We read a lot of, again, photocopied short pieces, but I have several physical books here to show you. And the first is the play Fuente Ovejuna by Lope de Vega. As far as I can tell, Lope de Vega is the closest thing that Spain has to Shakespeare. He was their biggest Renaissance playwright. And Fuente Ovejuna, as far as I can tell, we didn't read the whole thing, but it is about an entire town getting together to fool the authorities. And they're striving for monarchical and aristocratic reform of the way that they are ruled by creating this fictional person, Fuente Ovejuna. I also have a copy of El Lazarillo de Tormes. This is the full edition of that Renaissance prose work. I read either pieces of it in high school or a simplified version in my junior year of high school, but we read this full version in my Literature of the Golden Age class. And Lazarillo de Tormes feels very Dickensian when I explain it, but imagine a Dickensian plot in a medieval setting. So Lazarillo de Tormes is a young boy who is extremely poor, who keeps getting sold to a variety of different masters. And each of these masters is extremely cruel to him in very different ways. And he has to figure out ways to fool them to either earn money for himself or earn food and clothing. It, now that I describe it, sounds absolutely cruel, but it can actually be oddly funny in parts, and I'm very glad that I have a copy. From that class, I also have a copy of Novelas Ejemplares by Miguel de Cervantes, which are his other most famous works. They are a collection of short stories that he wrote. He is, of course, most famous for writing El Quijote. I also bought several books for myself while I was in Spain, which include Mucho Ruido y Pocas Nueces, which is the Spanish translation of Much Ado About Nothing. I bought this purely for three reasons. One, it is my favorite Shakespeare play. Number two, I love the way they translated the title. It literally translates to a lot of noise and few nuts. And number three, I wanted to see how they translated Beatrice's line that the Count is neither sad, nor sick, nor merry, nor well, but civil Count. Seville as an orange and something of that jealous complexion. Seville, the city, is known for its oranges and orange production, so I wanted to see how they would make that work in Spanish. And I was very disappointed to take it home and they just stuck in a footnote after translating it literally, and stuck in a footnote saying, in English, civil and Seville are puns, so there would be a joke here. I understand why they did it, but it was slightly disappointing. I was hoping for something slightly more exciting. I also, early on, picked up Sentido y Sensibilidad, or a translation of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And this was my go-to early on. I was very homesick in that first month, so being able to read something by one of my favorite authors in Spanish to keep me grounded in where I was a wonderful way to move through that section. I also bought myself 2 P.G. Wodehouse novels while I was there. First of all, De Acuerdo, Jeeves, or Righto, Jeeves, which I read through and absolutely adored. I loved picking up 1920s slang in Spanish, and you can't not smile when you're reading a P.G. Wodehouse novel. The other one I did not read, nor have I ever read. I feel like I would want to read it in English before I read it in Spanish to make sure that I was familiar with the episodes in it, was Júbilo Matinal, or Joy in the Morning, which is another P.G. Wodehouse novel, but one that I am less familiar with. I also have several books in my classroom. Once I started teaching, I started collecting a variety of books in Spanish that are probably considered more children's books, but I think they're appropriate for any age. I have the entire Harry Potter series in Spanish that is kept in a very special place and is only lent out to very special students who I know will take care of them, because it took me years to track down each of the books in the series over 2 or 3 continents and over several years. And I also have collections of Peanuts comics and Calvin and Hobbes comics, which are some of my favorite cartoon series in the first place. But I also love using them as quick reading activities with beginner learners. They're a nice, easy way to ease into reading in the target language. For myself, however, I picked up a couple other books, and the first was A Punto de Partir by Fran Nerd, who is here on YouTube. She is an incredible illustrator, and this is a graphic novel that she wrote about meeting her husband and getting married, and their eventual moves all over the world before they eventually settled in the UK. It's very sweet, it's very moving. Her illustration style is absolutely adorable. And I loved seeing Europe from a Latin American point of view. Then I went back to Spain on vacation a few years later and picked up a couple books, because when don't I come back from vacation with more books? And the first one was Yerma, also by Federico Garcia Lorca, which is another fantastic play about women in society, and specifically one woman's struggle with infertility and the lengths that it drives her to. I love Lorca's style of writing, especially in his plays, and if you get the chance to see the National Theatre's production starring Billie Piper, it was obviously not in Spanish, they used a translation of this play, but it was stunningly done and so incredibly moving. I was lucky enough to see it in New York 2 or 3 years ago, and it was absolutely wonderful and an excellent addition to having read the original. Because I love Federico Garcia Lorca so much, I also picked up his complete poetry, which is massive. He wrote tons in such a short amount of time. It is my goal to eventually read all of this. I don't know how long that would take me, but this is also quite special because I picked up this edition in the Alhambra bookshop. And finally, in Seville, I picked up this tiny book of Pablo Neruda's love poetry. No, he wasn't Spanish, he is also Chilean, but his love poetry is a staple of Spanish writing and Spanish literature, by which I mean literature written in Spanish. So of course I had to pick it up. I have also picked up several books that I have not read yet at a variety of book sales and online. The first is this bilingual edition of El Poema del Mio Cid, or the poem of El Cid, who was a famous medieval warrior who helped Ferdinand and Isabella reclaim Spain from the Muslim rulers who had been ruling it for the past 700 years. Yes, that's a tricky time in history, but this is a staple of medieval Spanish literature, rather like Beowulf or the Canterbury Tales is in English. I also have La Celestina by Fernando de Rojas, which is a play which I saw as a film for my Spanish Civilization class senior year, starring a very young Penelope Cruz, which I absolutely adored, but I have yet to finish the actual play. La Celestina involves 2 plots which overlap occasionally. The first is very much a Romeo and Juliet type plot of 2 young lovers who are trying to devise a way to be together. And in addition, there is the plot of La Celestina, who is an old woman, a wise woman, a healer, potentially a witch, to whom everyone goes for advice, for medicine. She is also known to rehacer vírgenes, or to remake virgins, which was a thing in the medieval era. I'm not sure how, and I'm not sure I want to know. But it was a fascinating film, so I really want to finish this play at some point. I also have the classic Cien Años de Soledad, or 100 Years of Solitude, by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is I don't even think I need to tell you what it's about. I don't think anyone really does know what it's about before they go into it. But it is a staple of Latin American magical realism, well, South American magical realism, that I really need to read at some point. My friend's been pressuring me for years to read it since he has read it in English. So I promise at some point we will do that. I also have the definitive edition of Don Quixote de la Mancha by Miguel de Cervantes. This was edited by the Real Academia Española, which is the grammar convention, as I explain it to my students. They are the society that sets all of the language conventions for the entire Spanish language. So I love that I have their edition of this classic work. It is, however, massive, so I don't know when I'm going to do it, but I definitely want to do it. One of my professors said that she reads El Quijote every year, and she cries every time, and I completely understand why. So I'm desperate to start that tradition for myself at some point. I also have Como Agua para Chocolate, or Like Water for Chocolate, by Laura Esquivel, which is another magically real novel about a young woman who I believe is in love with the man that her sister marries, or someone who close to her marries. And all of her emotions come out in the food that she cooks. So whenever you eat something that she cooks, everyone is able to feel what she was feeling at the time, with sometimes comic and sometimes tragic consequences. Goodreads has marked that I read this in 2014, and I have no memory of doing that, whether it was in English or in Spanish. So I would very much like to read it again, just to say that yes, indeed, I have actually read it now. Finally, coming round full circle, I have two other books that I picked up at the most recent library book sale that I went to last year. The first is Manual de Dialectología Hispánica, the Manual of Hispanic Dialects, which sounds very dry and very boring, but I love it for two reasons. Number one, I love studying dialects. That was my favorite part of being a linguistics major. In addition, on that same day, I also found a copy of El Capitán a la Triste by Arturo y Carlota Pérez Reverte, which is a wonderful novel of swashbuckling adventure in the 1600s in Spain, and at some point Charles II turns up as a young boy, and Capitán a la Triste has to help him regain the throne of England. It's a wonderful adventure, and I read this as part of a project that we did at the end of AP Spanish, where we had to read a full book in Spanish that we had never read before. So I began reading El Capitán a la Triste, and it was my teacher's copy that she had lent to me. And the beautiful thing is, not only does this look like the exact edition that she lent me, but both of these books were found underneath another book that had her name written in it in that book sale. So I have a feeling these two were her exact copies. So that makes them extra special and extra wonderful. If these are yours, thank you so much, Senora Ross, for everything, including giving me where I am today as a Spanish teacher. I would also highly recommend the Spanish language author Ildefonso Falcones. I read this English translation before I realized that it was a translation, but it is an excellent novel whichever language you read it in. It is about a gypsy community, and yes, I use that term realizing that it is a racial slur. However, that is the term that they use in the novel. They do not use the term Roma, as is preferred by the actual Roma community. And it is also the story of a Cuban slave who is wandering the streets of Seville. She has just been freed by her master and has been shipped over from Cuba and set free in Spain, and she has no idea what to do with herself. And she falls in with this family of gypsies and gets to know the rest of the community in Seville. And the man that she falls in love with had been a slave at some point, and there's a flamenco song that he composed while he was essentially working in the work camps during his time there, that he has never sung since, and he will only sing during times of the extremest hardship and sorrow. And it's also the story of his granddaughter and the hardships that the entire gypsy community faced from the Spanish government in the 18th century. It is a wonderful, wonderful epic story. It is a chunkster, but it is so worth it. And he has also written the book La Mano de Fatima, which sounds absolutely incredible. Sounds like it has to do with either the conquista or the reconquista of southern Spain by Islamic rulers, which you don't need to tell me anymore. Those are some magic words for me in terms of books. And indeed, there was one book that my teacher recommended to us in high school that I have not been able to find since, so I'd be really intrigued if any of you know what it was. It was, I believe, a full novel. It may have been a short story about this small village, and one day this man shows up. He seems to have just fallen from the sky. No one knows where he came from, but everyone begins to believe that he might be an angel. And it's about what happens to the town as he lives there and as they figure out exactly who or what he is. It sounded absolutely amazing, but I have not been able to find it since, to find out a potential title or author, nothing. If that sounds familiar to you, please let me know. So those are all of the Spanish language books that I have read or that I want to read in the immediate future. Let me know down below if you have read any others that you think I would enjoy, or if you are interested in any of these and I can give you further information. And until next time, everyone, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye, everyone.